All right. Hello, everybody. And welcome back to the last, well, I should say not last, but the unit that's going to talk about firm costs and things like that. We had, this is a really big unit. That's why I call it 4A, 4B, 4C. 4C here, there's a couple modules in this one. Relatively quick, relatively easy. We're going to talk about monopolies and monopolistically competitive markets here. Um, Now that you know perfectly competitive and you know monopolies, these two should be relatively easy. Where they're using the exact same MC equals MR, the same equations for everything. It's just a little bit different characteristics of those markets. So that's what we'll talk about through the next couple videos. So we're going to talk about oligopolies, and eventually in the next module, in module 45 or 65, we'll talk about game theory. Okay. So in this first module, this is module 64. Um, we're going to talk about what is an oligopoly, and then we're going to talk about collusion, and then module 65, we'll talk about game theory, which is probably one of my favorite things um, to do in this unit. Okay, so when we think about the four markets, and we looked up here, we're going to talk about an oligopoly. So we talked about perfectly competitive with tons and tons and tons of people in the market. Then we talked about a pure monopoly, which is only one in the market. Now, an oligopoly, we're looking at 2 to 4 firms that are controlling the market. Okay, so if we look, a few large producers, less than 10. And like we said, usually we're looking at 2 to 4 that just completely dominate the market. There's things called duopolies where there's only two. So essentially, you're looking at the HHI or the concentration ratios to see how much market shares the top couple companies control. Identical or differentiated products. I always like to use cereal as an example. When you think of Kellogg's Post, Quaker, and General Mills, that pretty much dominate. If you go down the cereal aisle, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different cereals on the one side there, but pretty much those four dominate the market. Okay, high barriers to enter. Okay, you can kind of look at maybe even the auto industry. It's really hard to get into that industry. Um, they can have control over the price. They're price makers. We are going to study, though, in oligopolies, they are very interdependent. So, depending on what they do, they can practice this thing called game theory. So, we're going to study how um, if an oligopoly chooses to compete with one another, they'll look more like a perfectly competitive market or some of the characteristics. But if they choose to collude, which in America is illegal, they'll look more like a monopoly. So we talk about interdependence, right? They use strategic pricing, to regulate their market. And like we said, OPEC, cereal car producers, these are examples of, when we say that they're interdependence, they kind of depend upon others in the strategies. So how do markets become oligopolies? It occurs when only a few firms start to control an industry. High barriers to enter. Types of barriers, the economies of scale. All right, so we had talked about the diseconomies of scale, the economies of scale, and constant returns of scale. These are typically in the economies of scale. It's really hard to enter. Uh, if you're When we think of the economies of scale, if a car industry is difficult to enter, because if I were to enter it, I'd be very difficult for me to enter in because the costs are so high for me to compete at some of the lower costs that these other firms have developed. The high startup cost to be into to create a factory. Do I have enough money to start that? And then a lot of times the barriers are, owning or controlling the raw materials. A lot of the cereal manufacturers, they actually own the farms that grow the wheat that they use for flour for their products. So they own control a lot of that raw material basis. Okay, so when we say, understand, Elliot, we want to use the HHI or the concentration ratio. HHI, remember, we square all the market shares of all the firms, and then we add them up. And HHI, we said in a pure monopoly, the HHI is 10,000. When you're talking about perfectly competitive, you're under 1,000. So when we look at like four firms, um, let's say four firms control the market, that's 25. So 25 squared plus 25 squared plus 25 squared plus 25 squared, right? Concentration ratio, we're looking at just the market shares of the top four or so. And that's what we're looking at to determine whether it's truly an oligopoly. And like we said, these are interdependents. They characterize by interdependence. In this industry, with the few sellers, the outcome for each seller depends on the behavior of the other. So they're depending on what the other firms are doing in the market. And if firms in an oligopoly collude, they'll appear as a monopoly. As I said before, if they decide to compete, they will look like a perfectly competitive market or behave similar to a competitive market. So game theory will be used. Okay. One that we see that your book talks about is the idea of duopolists. Two firms control the market. Okay. And we have an example of lysine when it comes to that. Like, if they decide to collude, when only two firms control the prices and they control kind of the market, they could collude. And what they'll do is they'll set the price where they collect the greatest revenue, hoping to create the greatest profit. So that's kind of like price. This idea of their price makers is very similar to the monopoly when they're like that. So, like we said before, in an oligopoly, they could choose to collude, but the problem is, um, can you trust the person you're colluding with? Okay, and one of the greatest collusions are cartels. And once again, in America, cartels are illegal. Okay, but when collusion does happen, um, they're going to agree on certain restrictions, certain amount of production. Probably the greatest cartel, or one of the greatest cartels today, is OPEC, the oil producing exporting countries of, what is that, North Africa, the eastern part of North Africa, and the Middle East, where they control the oil production essentially in the eastern hemisphere, and they play a significant role on the price per barrel. So they may cut production or raise production that shifts the supply curve right and left for oil, which changes the world price. So uh, that's something to think about when they work together. They can also engage in other activities of whether they're going to offer like a when we think of cereal, are they offering certain other coupons or things like that to affect their price? Or if we think of car manufacturers, certain safety things or new innovations. So those are things they like to watch by their competitor. Um, when you think of the candy industry, you have like Tootsie Roll and Hershey. Well, if Hershey goes up in price, Tootsie Roll may choose to up their price at the same time because Hershey's upping their price so that they stay together. You would think that Tootsie Roll may say, hey, we're going to keep our candy a little bit cheaper, but eventually they may have to raise their price because everything is scarce. So they don't want to have to raise the price, and Hershey go, well, look, we haven't changed our. Tootsie might raise their price at the exact same time that they see Hershey do it, because they're looking again, once again, at the behavior of a competitor. So, like we said, uh, OPEC is probably one of the largest cartels, right? And what they'll do is they'll, combine their ideas together or combine their companies' ideas together and behave like a monopoly in this cartel. So if we take a look here at this schedule of lysine, if we look at the price per pound and we look at the quantity and the total revenue, you would think that each company is going to work against one another and compete. But if they actually collude, they're going to choose a price of $6 per pound because that is the greatest amount of total revenue and therefore hopefully the greatest amount of profit. So firms will collude to get the greatest revenue. And if you look at this demand curve, you can see the top half as you decrease price, we could say decrease price, total revenue goes up. But when you start really low and the price goes up, you see that the total revenue goes up. So the bottom half of the demand curve is inelastic and the top half of the demand curve is elastic. And that's why we see right here at the price of $6 is kind of the spot of unit elastic. Okay. So once again, if we think of that lysine, they have to compete. They're competing for profit shares, they're competing for money, but can you trust your competitors if they collude? That's the thing about game theory. If they turn around and uh, there's an incentive to cheat, right? And that's that game theory idea. Because if they both companies that sell lysine decide to go $6 and then one of them says, hey, we're going to drop it down to $5. Well, everyone's going to leave the $6 and go to buy the $5. So there's this competition. Okay. It's almost like the game theory they talk about what they call the prisoner dilemma. And if you and I were arrested and we're both going to have each other's back, and the old snitches or snitches or snitches get stitches. Well, can you trust the person you're with to not sell you out? Right? The police could offer them a better deal versus you, and you hold out, but your person that you depend upon, they have the incentive to get less time in jail. That's the same thing. That's game theory. That's prisoner's dilemma. All right. So really, most of the time, it's really there's an incentive to cheat the system. Okay. So when firms ignore, this idea of collusion, they're practicing non-cooperative behavior. They're looking for themselves, and when you look for yourself, once again, there is this competition. We look at this idea of looking for your own self-interest, and that's what the non-cooperative behavior is when firms act in their own self-interest, ignoring the effects of their actions on someone else's firm's profits, because you're only looking for your own firm. And once again, if you're going to practice collusion, that's not what you do for collusion. Okay. Now sometimes collusion happens without actually negotiating, because remember, in America technically that's illegal, but you do see firms that do collude. The gas stations, let's say there's two or three gas stations, there's four corners in an intersection, and let's say three of the corners are gas stations. They all could choose to just look at each other's prices across the way, and they all make sure they're at the exact same price. And then if one falls a penny below, then the others fall, so they're kind of playing follow the leader when it comes to prices. Okay. So realistically, when we understand oligopolies, we have to understand there's only a few firms. There could be duopolies, right? Um, they they can exist for more or less the same reasons as a monopoly, right? They could practice collusion, right? They're in an imperfect market. They're charging higher prices if they act like if they collude and practice like a cartel. They are going to produce less at a higher price because they have that incentive to try to make more money as long as they work together. But if they choose to not cooperate, then they're behaving a little bit more like a perfectly competitive market and lowering the prices, and that then becomes kind of their downfall. So once again, we have to look at their behaviors. Now, in the next module, we'll look at actual the ideas of game theory and the prisoner's dilemma. So we'll take a look at that in the next module. All right. So with that being said, we will talk to you guys later. Hopefully everyone's doing well, and see you soon.